Hi, everybody. Welcome to a confined edition of The World This Week. I'm François Picard. And, we're trying to do our best. We're joined this Friday by our own Lila Jacinto, Rachel Donadio of The Atlantic, and Christopher Dickey, foreign editor of The Daily Beast. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. How's everyone doing in our second week of confinement?
A little bit of claustrophobia.
I'm doing fine. I'm in splendid isolation.
Splendid isolation. How about you, Rachel?
I'm doing okay. I have a view of the sky, which is nice. Helps.
All right, let's begin, if you will, with the latest news.
Hi folks, I want to bring you up to speed with something that's happening today, which is that I've developed mild symptoms of the coronavirus. That's to say, a temperature and a persistent cough. And on the advice of the chief medical officer, I've taken a test that has come out positive. So I am working from home, I'm self-isolating, and that's entirely the right thing to do. But be in no doubt that I can continue, thanks to the wizardry of modern technology, to communicate with all my top team to lead the national fight back against coronavirus.
So your thoughts on Boris Johnson being in splendid isolation, Leela?
We're seeing a lot of politicians testing positive. I mean, this is understandable because they're obviously meeting a lot of people. But a lot of people are noting that it was in early March that Johnson was shaking hands with people and joking about this. And in a matter of weeks, he's tested positive. And this really underscores the importance of how infectious this disease is and how authorities have to and should have responded far more quicker than they have.
Yeah, hindsight, of course, is 2020, Christopher Dickey.
Look, it's not hindsight. Boris Johnson's policy initially was one of trying to encourage something called herd immunity. The notion that he was pressing early in this crisis was that as many people as possible should get this. And of course, some old folks were going to die, but we can handle this and it'll be better the next time around with this virus, maybe in the fall. Theoretically, maybe that makes some sense, but finally, studies done in Great Britain itself showed that the system would be completely overwhelmed by such a policy, by so many people falling sick, so many people dying, which is something that, by the way, everybody else in the world knew, except for apparently Boris Johnson and Donald Trump. So the net effect, of course, is that now there is a huge crisis in Great Britain. It's growing by the day. When you look at the charts on the Johns Hopkins chart, it's no longer ... it's leap in Great Britain, just as it is in the United States now. And, you know, at the end of the day, you have to look at Boris Johnson and say, he's a fool, and he fooled a lot of people in his country, and a lot of people will probably lose their lives as a result of that. The last question I would have about Boris Johnson is, who the hell was he talking to and greeting and hanging out with the last few days when he was probably at maximum contagion? We don't know. We know he was with the Chancellor of the Exchequer. We know he was with the Health Minister. Was he with Prince Charles, who also has it? We don't know. But he should be traced.
Before we went on air, we were talking about how we all saw this coming. No one more so than you, Rachel Donadio, who follows things out of Italy. Again, this is such an unprecedented situation. Can you give policymakers a free pass for, underestimating just because we've never seen anything like this before?
I don't think you can. I mean, I don't think there's a government on earth that's handled this particularly well. The Chinese dissembled about it and then went into this massive authoritarian overdrive. The Italians began in February isolating different towns outside Milan, putting those on a kind of quarantine. And then on March 8th, all of a sudden, the announcement came that the Prime Minister of Italy would put parts of northern Italy, Lombardy, the richest and most powerful and now hardest hit region, on lockdown. And that should have come as a massive warning to policymakers, leaders around the world. At first, it seemed, oh, okay, well, that's just Lombardy. But the fact is, we've been saying this for weeks, every other country is on the same curve that Italy is on, which means that unless you make people stay home, the infection rate is so high that more and more people will get this, and now more and more people are sick. And that's what we're seeing now in Italy. The death count there and also in Spain and now in New York is getting really high. And we're also starting to see in Italy that the infection rate has kind of stabilized, which means that as of now, it's around 8.8%, whereas when the Prime Minister of Italy put those parts of northern Italy on lockdown, it was around 29%, which means that it was just spreading super fast. So I think we should not give policymakers a free pass. I mean, it's true it's unprecedented and people are scrambling, but Italy wasn't this over-emotional outlier. It was just ahead of the curve in time.
Yeah, and I'm also starting to question this idea of what constitutes criminal negligence, because there's a lot of answering to do. Apart from authorities that did not respond in time, it's also authorities that had the time. You know, there's a time lag, so some countries are catching up now, and how they are implementing their lockdown measures. I'm thinking of India, for instance. You know, given that they had so many weeks of preparation, how did India get into a lockdown where the entire country of 1.3 billion people had 4 hours to prepare for an absolutely draconian lockdown?
Let's talk about that. Let's talk about that, Leela. We can listen now to the announcement that came from the Prime Minister.
संपूर्ण देश में संपूर्ण लॉकडाउन होने जा रहा है। हिंदुस्तान को बचाने के लिए, हिंदुस्तान के हर नागरिक को बचाने के लिए, आपको बचाने के लिए, आपके परिवार को बचाने के लिए।
So Leela, the Prime Minister has taken it into overdrive since that piece you wrote over last weekend. Is he rebounding well?
Look, like Rachel, you know, we were seeing the signs, and as I mentioned in the piece before the lockdown, that this needs to happen in India. So the question is not whether these measures needed to be put in place. It was the lack of preparedness for it. It was nothing on the scale. This kind of lockdown has not been done anywhere else in the world. Not even China has done it like that. China isolated the provinces that were affected. What Narendra Modi was talking about in that clip that you played was like the entire nation is going into lockdown. So there are a couple of things here. One is the lack of planning. There was no supply chains, no emergency measures put in place, no measures for any sort of public transportation. You know, people have lives, they've got to manage all their lives. Then you're talking about the peculiarities of countries like India, and which we're going to see in Africa as well, where you have more than 90% of the population employed in the informal sector. Where do they go? Where do they go in a lockdown? And you have so many homeless people. And then finally, also what you're seeing is all the policies that have been taking place for years that really come up in the time of a crisis, which is the law enforcement machinery in some of the states run by the ruling Hindu nationalist BJP party. The police are really shock forces. They're sort of shock troops. So the orders that went down were implemented in this extremely harsh way where, you know, police are beating up people. It was a sort of a vigilante display on the streets. India doesn't need to be like this. It has a public distribution system that has been in place since nearly independence time. They've got health measures. So there was no reason, and there was enough time for this. Prime Minister Modi, the last weekend, had declared a one-day curfew and invited people at 5 p.m. to come out and clap their hands, which just turned into pandemonium on the streets. And there was no isolation at all. So there was time for all these things, but there was no emergency planning put into place.
Hello, François.
Yeah, no emergency planning put into place. Let's talk a little bit about the situation here in France, where they're sort of doing it as they go along. We'll show images, for instance, that made the rounds of the healthcare workers in Strasbourg who have been using a TGV high-speed rail to move some of the patients that are swamped in the Alsace region of eastern France over to the western part of the country. Your thoughts, Christopher Dickey, on how the French healthcare services are rolling with the punches?
Well, I think the healthcare services in France were pretty badly stretched to begin with. I don't think, there's a lot of talk about how great the French healthcare system is, but in fact, it's been deteriorating a lot over the years. That's why we've had a lot of strikes by healthcare workers. That's why I know any number of doctors who have just decided to retire early. As a result, when you have a crisis like this, it really puts a strain on the system. That said, I think things have been pretty well organized. The army, for instance, is now being used to help move people out of the areas that are most affected into areas where they can get better treatment. I think one of the things that people forget about this almost all the time in these kinds of discussions is that the problem is not just the people who have coronavirus or have serious cases of COVID-19 and are having trouble breathing and all the things that are part of that disease. It's the people who have everything else, anything else wrong with them. People who break legs, people who have recurrent diseases, people who have acute conditions. What happens if you get appendicitis right now? Where do you go? Does it rupture? Do you die? The healthcare system has to accommodate that as well. And I think that the French system has been trying very hard to deal with all of that and has been doing a pretty good job. The death rate here is much lower than I might have expected it to be, say, a week ago or 2 weeks ago. Although it's not great, it's still nothing like as high as Italy, nothing like as high as Spain, and God help us, nothing like as high as the United States will be in a few days.
But one of the things about this death rate is that it also depends on how much testing is taking place, right? So if there are more people tested, then the death rate falls. And this is another thing that biostats experts are talking about, the lack of standardization of how all this data is being collected.
Well, we've done a lot of looking at that at the Daily Beast to try and figure out, what kinds of numbers make sense. The truth is, you could say no numbers make sense because there's been almost no randomized testing. Almost all the testing has been, you get symptoms, maybe you have to have bad symptoms, then you get tested. Certainly that's the case here in France. It's also the case in Pennsylvania or New York City. It's the case lots of places that you have to have the disease, unless you're Boris Johnson, you have to have the disease and have very serious symptoms before anybody will test you. So that obviously skews the numbers. Now, Rachel may know about this. Certainly, I was talking to our correspondent in Rome. In Italy, they are doing now testing in all of the Veneto region for everybody, which means that we will have the results of that randomized testing, and we can begin in an area that's had a serious outbreak to get a real picture of how many people were infected, how many people got better, how many people died from the disease, and so on. But you're absolutely right, Leila. There's been a lot of discrepancies. Here in France, for instance, it's only now that they are beginning to count people who are in assisted living facilities who get coronavirus and who die. Previously, those people weren't counted, and obviously it's potentially a very significant number.
Yeah, no, I think across Europe, it's not, I don't know if the standards have been different, but the way that the information has been coming in has been different. There was some discussion this week about why the death rate has been so, or the death count, frankly, has been so low in Germany, for instance. And partly it's, I think, because they haven't always tested people post-mortem. They have the capability to do it, but I don't know whether they have been doing it. But I think that as, unfortunately, the deaths go up across the world, I think we're going to see that the statistic, I mean, they kind of come in line. For instance, I mean, a lot of people have been dying in Italy. It has the second oldest population in the world after Japan, but I don't think that the percentage of people of that age group who've died in Italy is higher than that in China and other places. It's just that it was, all of these deaths happening so in such swift succession.
And we also have to look at countries which we know have been almost absolute certainty have been lying about their numbers or hiding their numbers actively. The two most conspicuous cases being Japan, where Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was desperate to hold the Olympics on schedule in July and didn't want anything to interfere with that. So their testing has been absolutely minimal. Now that the Olympics have been postponed until next year sometime, suddenly they're testing lots of people, and suddenly the government is saying, prepare yourself for news of major outbreaks here. Well, of course, because now they're testing people.
Yeah, I just want to dig in on that one point, which is you can see there in the frame. This is a picture that was posted in the New York Times, taken Thursday by the photographer Norigo Hayashi in central Tokyo. People going to cafes, going to bars, and in Japan, the real question is, have they been under testing?
Yeah, well, yes, they definitely have been under testing. There's no question about that. But the most egregious case is Russia, where, for instance, in St. Petersburg, they were talking about 100,000 cases of suspected SARS, as if that's different from coronavirus. It's not. Coronavirus is a SARS virus, but they didn't want to call it coronavirus because, again, President Putin wanted a vote on April 22nd that would make him effectively president for life. And they want to hold their May 9th Victory Day celebrations for the 75th anniversary of their victory over the Nazis. They didn't want anything to interfere with that. Well, now, once again, the cases have become so numerous that the mayor of Moscow was saying, you know, we're not counting the vast number that we have. And even Putin is now going to hospitals and putting on a hazmat suit and pretending like he's leading the charge against the disease that he did his best to cover up and ignore until a week ago.
But that brings us back to what Rachel was alluding to a minute ago, and I'll put it to you, Leela, which is the Germans seem to be testing a lot more than other Europeans, including here in France.
Well, I mean, is this a question on European unity? Because ultimately it comes down to in the European Union, health has always been a national issue. So even within Europe, where there should be much more cooperation and definitely cooperation in a public health response, we have different systems.
Yeah. And there's been a lot of nationalism. I mean, people want to keep, you know, countries want to keep their medical equipment national and not share it.
Well, why hasn't there been more testing? That's the question everyone's asking.
There aren't enough tests. There are not enough tests. The companies that have not been making tests quickly enough, one of the companies that makes the swabs you use is in Lombardy, which is the hardest hit region in Italy. I mean, I'm not saying that that's to blame for the entire shortage of tests around the world, but there's a supply chain issue, and I also think that there aren't enough people to administer the tests. So including in France, we're advised that if we get symptoms, stay home unless it's really bad and you can't breathe, in which case call emergency services. But I think we've been seeing the reports coming out of New York now that people are just told, you probably, if these are your symptoms, you probably have it, and just stay home unless you really, you know. So the testing would have been useful and still is useful, but a couple of weeks ago when people were walking around not knowing they had symptoms. I mean, we had a really excellent story in The Atlantic by my colleague Ed Yong, who, which is kind of about what's going to happen now. And he says there are two categories of people on Earth. Category A is people who have COVID-19, and category B is people who might have it, who might not know that they have it, who don't want to get it and need to stay home. I mean, you know, so I really think that it's all...
Chris,
I wish there were...
Are you as fatalistic about this issue? Well, because we've spoken to medical specialists at France 24 who say the tests are coming, they're just not here yet. Your thoughts on that?
Look, I think everybody's scrambling, and already we've seen China exporting, or a Chinese company, BioEasy, exporting tests that are 80% ineffective, 80% wrong. So I think we're going to see a lot of problems. So they were used in the Czech Republic. They've been used in Spain. Not very helpful at all. This is not a question of scapegoating. It is a question of lots of different manufacturers, different companies trying to produce these tests. Some of them will work, some of them won't. One of the reasons that as I understand it, that the tests were so slow in being distributed in the United States is that originally there was an effort to control everything through the CDC. And there was a reluctance to let individual hospitals and labs across the country developed these tests or organized these tests because there was a desire to keep quality control. Then it turned out that the CDC tests were faulty. So it's been a disaster in terms of testing. But the other thing that's hugely important is tracing the contacts of anybody who has the disease. And to the extent that we've been able to find out why the death toll is so low in Germany, it's not just that they don't count certain things. That's not as much the case as we had suspected in the beginning, but it is the case that they have done much better contact tracing than most other places. And certainly in South Korea, which is the country you can hold up as an example of an effective program to stop the disease, to contain and stop the disease, contact tracing has been absolutely central to their operation. We just had a piece in the Daily Beast saying that now in the United States, it is simply far too late to impose or carry out effective contact tracing. So that's off the charts.
My colleagues in The Atlantic a couple of weeks ago did a very good story in which they tried to call all the health departments of all 50 states to understand how many tests have you done. And it's all over the map. Some would give information, some wouldn't. And it was just clear that there was no clear coordinated response. And the US lost 3 weeks, 3 crucial weeks.
And this comes back to Leela's point. You could see this coming. It's like watching a tsunami coming across the water.
Yeah.
And yet people didn't prepare. Forget locking down. They didn't prepare the hardware. They didn't prepare the masks. They didn't prepare the ventilators. They didn't prepare all the things that were needed. They didn't prepare. And no country was more egregiously unprepared than the United States, which only last October was, at least by one survey, judged the country most well adapted to dealing with a pandemic.
I don't know about you, Chris, but the pictures of medics at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York wearing plastic bags because there aren't enough protective gear, that just was stunning to me. I mean, that's a very well-equipped Manhattan hospital. And if that hospital doesn't have enough protective gear, I am very worried to think about what will happen in the rural United States and in, let alone, you know, the rest of the rest of the world.
Terribly worried about my many friends in New York. Of course, the Daily Beast is based in New York, but I have lots of friends there. I have a little pied-à-terre there in the building where that apartment is. We already have one woman who has a case of COVID-19. So it's unbelievable.
Yeah. I did lose a friend in New York City, but I mean, if you look at the messaging as well, you know, what Rachel was talking about, you know, you're seeing healthcare workers in the world superpower having plastic bags on their face, and on the other hand, you have a messaging of China, you know, sending in a medical crew to help Italy. You know, the Chinese propaganda will have you believe that they are donating face masks to Italy and Spain when in fact they are selling them. You know, this comes down to two things. One is, you know, China has the capacity to manufacture a lot, so we're going to have to probably rely on their stocks for basic things like face masks. But you're literally seeing this crisis where the US is just not being seen as the leader of the world anymore. And China is completely using this crisis to get on a soft power initiative.
Well, let's talk about that, Leela. Let's talk about that issue of leadership, because that's what we talked about at the outset. And it's been so important. We know the United States, we won't go over it again. Donald Trump saying he'd like to see things open by Easter, how much controversy that has stirred. And of course, one man who's sort of stood out is the governor of New York State. It's Andrew Cuomo, who's been giving these daily press conferences, like the one 2 days ago when he discussed clever ways in which they're trying to get more respiratory systems to the people. Let's take a listen.
We have approved the technology that allows one ventilator to serve 2 patients, what they call splitting, which is where you add a second set of tubes to a ventilator to do 2 patients. It's not ideal, but we believe it's workable. We're also converting anesthesia machines to ventilators.
Rachel Donadio, your thoughts on everyone waxing lyrical about the governor of New York now?
he is telling it like it is and saying the death rate is going to go up and saying this is why we need to stay inside and saying it's like, he used this metaphor the other day of the tap, like too many cases out. Okay, we close the tap, you stay home. It strikes me as, I think he's done very respectable and good briefings, and he's taken questions and he's answered the questions, and he has put New York on, doing more tests and having more of a lockdown than other parts of the country. I think that it just speaks to what Leela was saying and what we were saying before about, different leaders are kind of trying to bend reality to suit their own needs, whether that's wanting to hold the Victory Day celebration in Russia, whether that's wanting to hold the Olympics in Japan. But I think in this day and age, what's really admirable is when a political leader says, like, this is what's going on and it's really bad, I mean, sure, he's seen as the counterbalance to Trump. Trump will just say we're going to open everything until Easter. Trump has said he wants things open by Easter, which does not seem realistic when you look at that Johns Hopkins dashboard of the number of cases. So I think that Cuomo has been admirable and that he says very clearly, we're in big trouble and here are the numbers and here's what I'm seeing. And that is actually leadership today, to just say, tell it like it is.
Chris Verdicchio, are there lessons the French leaders could learn from this kind of messaging?
Well, I think so, yeah. But I'm not sure that the French have really tried to hide anything. I don't think this is not Russia. This is not Japan. I think that Macron may have been a little bit late, addressing the crisis. But when he did, I think he was extremely frank. I don't think there was any sense that he was hiding anything. I mean, I will always remember listening to him say that, we'll beat this thing, but the day after tomorrow is not going to be like the day before this started. And that's exactly right. It's not. We are entering a whole new world. And I think the French are aware of that. And I think the whole world had better be aware of that. The thing that's so painful to watch is a politician like Trump, or many people in Congress, or Shinzo Abe, or all these other politicians who want you to believe that this is going to be a little flash in the pan and we can just turn back the clock and it'll all be okay. And we'll go back to a raging stock market and it'll all be super. Well, maybe we will, in a couple of years, be living in the roaring 2020s, but it won't be the same as what we were living in before this started.
Yeah, and among the so many things that we've got to think about in what's going to happen is also for instance, in India, I've been seeing some pieces in very respectable Indian media talking about whether this response was necessary, and of course it spans the whole spectrum of whether this was necessary but badly planned, or this argument of are people going to die of coronavirus or are they going to die of hunger? Now, if this crisis is not well handled, and so the essential message of social messaging, there's a public outcry against it. We are also going to have to look at what is the psychological effect and what are the effects of public anger, public outbursts. If governments are not trusted in their own countries, can we see, this will have health impacts. This will have an impact on the economy as well. And it's overall proving that democracies that are open and transparent, you've got a pressure valve on public opinion.
And what will come under scrutiny perhaps as well, Leela, is the role of government. One of the issues that we're suddenly focused on for decades, there have been funding problems in the French healthcare system, in the UK healthcare system, is, well, just simply, for instance, the number of hospital beds per country. And that's been glaring since the start of all of this.
Completely. And I unfortunately decided to look at the number of hospital beds in Africa. No surprises there. South Africa has, I think just today, started a nationwide lockdown. And some of the interviews that I've been hearing in South Africa is they're worried about the crime rate rising. So the health capacity of across the world. And this is not just in France. This is in several countries where, not enough of budgets have been allocated to public health. And we are absolutely seeing the effects of this now. And I know that a few weeks ago, I was talking about, well, Africa handled the Ebola crisis. But it now seems like this virus is getting into Africa, and no surprises, this continent is not going to be ready to manage a crisis at this scale.
No, our correspondent in Nigeria interviewed a taxi driver who's been picking up people coming back from Italy, picking up people coming back from the United States, coming back from lots of coronavirus hotspots, and who has had the symptoms himself acutely for a week and continued to work and hasn't been tested because, hey, he heard somewhere that down in Nigeria it's so warm and humid that you can't get coronavirus. Well, that's not right.
Yeah, and
what's starting to worry me just very quickly is that a lot of Africa's programs are Western funded and aided. And now as we are getting into probably a global economic crisis, we are not even going to have the capacity for all these international fundings that are really necessary.
Right, there's another aspect to all this which I want to broach before we conclude, and that is the issue of how we're all living under lockdown and how much solidarity that we're showing. In many countries, Italy, France, now the UK, they've been clapping for healthcare workers and other public sector workers every night. Our team, Alison Sargent and Julie Dungeloff, went to Lisieux, that's in the northwestern Normandy region, where the supermarket's been opening an hour early for healthcare workers before the general public. Let's take a look.
It's a shopping trip that starts with an ID check. Between the hours of 8 and 9 a.m., only medical workers and firefighters are allowed to enter this supermarket in northern France. With the aisles less crowded, the store's staff use the hour to restock their empty shelves. And the supermarket's accountant gets training to help out the cashiers.
Vous faites quoi, vous, madame, dans la vie?
Je suis infirmière.
C'est important pour vous que
Ah oui, c'est capital. C'est capital. Il faut qu'on donne de soi, il faut qu'on ne regarde pas nos heures, qu'on ne regarde pas nos jours de travail. Et voilà, il faut être solidaire.
With many seeking to avoid any chance of contact, delivery orders have multiplied.
On est à plus de 130 par jour. D'habitude, on était à 30 ou voire 50.
A rhythm kept up thanks to several new hires and the dedication of the supermarket staff.
On n'est pas à l'abri demain d'avoir un cas et si ça s'avérait et que effectivement il y en avait d'autres qui se trouvaient sur le carreau, ça serait un peu plus compliqué parce qu'aujourd'hui l'humain dans notre métier il est encore important. C'est l'humain aujourd'hui qui met en rayon et on a besoin de lui pour avoir des magasins qui tiennent à flot. Voilà.
And it's the people that the clients are most grateful for.
Ça fait du bien de voir les petites caissières qui ont bien du mérite. Dis donc, elles sont courageuses, hein, parce qu'il y en a qui auraient pu baisser les bras. Et puis... Bon courage, mesdames.
Merci, à bientôt. Encouragement they'll need to keep up their work for the weeks to come.
Your thoughts, Rachel Donadio, have we seen the best or the worst of human nature so far?
I think both. I think that on a global scale, just the different range of political reactions. I mean, I'm really worried about this, frankly, when I'm honest with myself, this is terrifying. But I do think on a human level, there's been a lot of good solidarity and connecting with friends. And I do think that supermarkets and these places that are really trying to help people, I think the fact that so many countries have put out calls for volunteers and for retirees and for medical students to come and help, and gotten huge number of people responding in Britain, France, and Italy. I mean, I think that's extremely heartening, and people just want to help. And there is solidarity unlike any I've seen, but I also just think that informal human solidarity is filling in for serious gaps in, in Europe, we're seeing a lot of nationalist divisions, and in the United States, it's each state kind of out for itself in a way, although maybe there'll be more of that. So the bottom line is, on a political level, there are some quite worrisome developments, but on a kind of a human level, like how people manage to survive in times of crises, there are many heartening example of
course,
that.
I've seen the opposite argument that with such a present and clear danger, that divisive politics almost irrelevant. I've seen some writers claim.
Where?
For Dickey.
Yeah, where are we talking about there? I'm not sure I could make that case. I like to think I can argue both sides of any question, but I'm not sure that we can say that divisive politics don't mean anything. I think they mean a hell of a lot. They have a lot to do with whether spending bills, hugely needed spending bills, get passed, how those bills are put together. Are they to rescue corporations? Are they to rescue the profligate airlines? Are they going to help people who really are in desperate need? The United States employment rate was based on a lot of very bad jobs with very poor healthcare, very poor insurance. Those are the first jobs to be lost. And believe me, $1,500 or $1,200 or even $3,000 for a family that's suddenly out of work, that's not much.
All right, so in 2008, Christopher, in 2008, when you had the financial crisis, you had the bailouts. There was public anger over the bailouts. The anger morphed into something else. This time around, are politicians going to have to handle things differently when it comes to helping out, as you say, those who need it the most?
I think we already have seen the effort to send out these checks and to say, yes, we're helping you out. The problem is it's just wildly inadequate. What's needed is not just money now, although that is needed. What's needed is a fundamental change to basic aspects of the infrastructure of government and governance in the United States, starting with healthcare. It doesn't have to be Bernie Sanders' universal healthcare, but it has to be something that's a hell of a lot better than exists right now. And if people don't understand that after this crisis, or right now, they certainly will after this crisis, we'll see if the politicians can actually do something about it. That's why politicians do matter.
Leo Jacinto, your thoughts here in France about how things may be different in the future?
Well, I have to say that I'm just happy with France's response so far. Although yesterday I went out and I saw police officers, they did not have face masks, which struck me about the number of people who are doing their jobs, people who are working at tailors, at shopping malls, who are putting their lives at risk. These are people who, a lot of them are not very well paid, and in the line of duty are putting their lives at risk. As for the longer picture of what comes out of this, will this be overall good, overall bad, glass half empty, glass half full? In the half empty, I'm worried about food stocks, frankly, because Russia, for one, has just asked for an investigation into its food stocks. They're looking into what sort of exports can they stop in order to keep their national stocks. And if we are going to get into this, where in rural and agricultural based countries, their harvests are going to be affected. If there's a national sort of nationalism that goes in, where everybody starts trying to protect their own food security, then we're in very big trouble. And this is not a financial crisis. This is a crisis that has got to do with the real economy. It's not just money.
It's definitely the case in developing parts of the world. But one of the days when I was most distraught was when the European Commissioner for the Internal Market warned that with all these borders popping up overnight inside Europe, that the delays of trucks and things moving around could potentially cause hiccups in the food supply in Europe. And this is Western Europe we're talking about, not, sub-Saharan Africa.
I was just showing their images. There was an EU summit that was done virtually on Thursday, and what they failed to agree on were these quote-unquote corona bonds to mutualize the debt between northern and southern Europe. Your thoughts on that, Rachel Donadio? Is it just because it's early days that they may get around to it? Or could this be the undoing of the European Union as we know it?
I think it could be the undoing of the European Union as we know it. We've seen it for a long time, and this might be just pushing it over the edge. I mean, one thing that it's hard to remember that while we're dealing with this global pandemic health crisis, also interlocking with that is a kind of European debt crisis, and whether Germany will agree to mutualize debt across Europe is a big question. And I don't know, I don't know whether German solidarity will go that far. It certainly didn't during the Euro crisis a decade ago. I don't know whether it will now, and that's going to have a huge impact for countries, especially Italy, Spain, countries across Southern Europe, whether they're going to be able to, have some flexibility to grow out of this crisis once the public health crisis subsides. I mean, the number of interlocking crises, I mean, our minds struggle to get our heads around it. It's a health crisis, it's a debt crisis, it's a real economy crisis, it's a public debt crisis, it's a, it's a national security crisis. It's like 9/11 meets the stock market crash, meets the 1918 pandemic, meets the 1929 stock market crash, meets 9/11. I mean, it's very hard to get our heads around this, I think.
One final question for all of you. I'll go around the rooms virtually speaking here. What's your recipe for beating cabin fever? I'll start with you, Christopher Dickey.
Zoom, WhatsApp, FaceTime, Skype. Those are great. I haven't done so much talking to friends face-to-face in years. It's not as much fun as going out for a drink with you after the show, François, but it's almost as fun. And I don't know if other people have been doing it, but it's becoming institutionalized to have aperitivi on Zoom or on WhatsApp. I could name any number of applications, but I think that's great, and that's a great way to fight cabin fever. The only other thing I'd say about it is that you think that going out is going to solve the problem, but you go to the market, maybe you go out for other reasons. But the truth is, it's such a hassle to go out after a while, where you have to undress when you get back, you have to wash everything down, you have to disinfect everything, you're wearing gloves, you're wearing a mask if you're lucky enough to get them, that ultimately going out doesn't feel like the solution it did the first couple of days of the lockdown. So I would say social media, live streaming video is the best solution.
Lila Jacinto?
Well, I think the secret is really your state of mind. I'm fine, and like Chris, I find it's an incredible hassle to get out. But then I've had injuries and I've had to stay indoors. And I always say the only, in situations where everything seems out of your control, the only thing that I do have control of is my worldview, and I'm not going to let myself get down. So I've got so many friends. I'm so busy speaking to everyone virtually. I'm speaking to people much more now than before the coronavirus. So that's the secret. Just stay safe.
Rachel?
Yeah, I also feel grateful to be in touch with friends and family around the world and to be talking with them. I had a kind of Zoom dance party with my niece and nephew the other day. I joined a reading group with my parents and saw all of a sudden on Zoom these faces of people I knew from my childhood, which moved me to tears. And I've also just been in touch with a lot of friends on WhatsApp. I mean, then there are jokes that, if coronavirus doesn't kill you, the online learning and all of the, staying in touch will. That's a bad joke. I mean, this is going to kill a lot of people. And I just hope, I hope that there's a solution to this soon. But in the short term, what is keeping me sane is just staying in touch with a lot of friends and family around the world. It's actually been really great.
All right, well, thank you for being in touch with all of us here at France 24. I want to thank you, Rachel Donadio, Christopher Dickey, Lila Jacinto, and we'll be in touch as we see. Each day brings a new challenge, both to our world news cycle and to all our lives personally. Thanks again for being with us.
Thanks. Bye, guys.
Bye-bye, François.
Bye.